Okay, I'm gonna go talk to a social worker. Be careful.
Goodbye.
Hello.
Oh, hi. Hey, what's up?
Nothing much at the moment. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. You have the best microphone of any random professional person I've ever talked to before. Congratulations.
I am borrowing my partner's setup. I don't do tech, but he
Oh.
does.
Is he a gamer?
I think that's the word you would use. Yes. It's my understanding anyways.
Well, does he use gamer words when he's playing games? I'm just kidding. Okay. Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody so they know who you are, what you want to talk about? Go.
Hello. My name is Karina. I am a psychology graduate student in a
Holy
clinical
Jesus. I thought this was a way
psychology.
different convo. Oh, man. Okay.
Uh-oh. Did you remember? Yeah. This is a doctoral psychology program. We had talking about dissociative identity disorder.
Oh, God. It's like the worst conversation. I thought we were talking about... I thought it was another social worker. Okay. Well,
Oh,
what's up?
no.
What do you got?
Um,
You're here to convince... So, I'm guessing you're... Are you upset by the fact that I said the idea is fake as fuck and I don't believe in anybody that says it's real? Or...
I mean, upset is probably not the correct word. I felt that people were coming on to talk about it with you, and they were speaking their opinion about it, which was cool. It's an opinion that is in the psych community, but they weren't talking at all about the rest of the diverse opinion, and that this is like a really complex topic among the psychological community.
Okay.
And so I thought they were just doing it a disservice.
Sure. Hit me up. Real quick, you said that you were a doctoral student. Are you allowed to say, like, what is your area of focus or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing a generalist program, clinical psychology, so I'm getting a PsyD rather than a PhD.
Okay.
Typically, that's supposed to mean that, like, I have more of a focus on clinical work than research.
Okay.
But my program actually requires me to do a dissertation, too. So,
Interesting. Okay. Fun.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't watch streamers all that often.
But
Sorry.
you're missing absolutely nothing of value there, so that's fine. Okay.
Perfect. But so I don't know if I've heard all of your opinion on DID. The 2 points I think I had heard from you was this idea that like it didn't make sense that the brain could fit multiple whole personalities, and that you didn't really think dissociative amnesia was real. That
Yeah,
it didn't
so-
make sense that people forget traumatic events.
Yeah, the main thing seemed to be, I think my understanding is that the underlying fundamental part of DID relies on this concept of dissociative amnesia being real. And my understanding is it's not even agreed upon what that necessarily means. And then in terms of there being like a biomechanical underpinning for it, I'm not saying like point me to the part of the brain that does this. Obviously, that's very difficult.
Okay.
But it doesn't seem like in any other like neurological sense or in any other clinical stuff, I've heard of this description of like, yeah, sometimes you can have 4 or 5 or 6 personalities split off or whatever. That just doesn't seem to be like a real thing that I've observed anywhere else. So yeah, go. That's like my general thoughts. Go for it. Hit me up.
So we can start with the dissociative amnesia piece.
Yeah.
There is, I think, decent research evidence for rare but present cases of people forgetting traumatic events. It is not very common. It's really infrequent.
Can I, real quick, when we say that, can I qualify? So when I said that I don't believe in that, there are 2 caveats where I think it's possible. One is with a substance being used. So obviously something like rufinol or whatever, or alcohol, right? And then the second is when a brain injury is involved, so like a concussion or something else. So in those 2 cases, I can believe. But yeah, okay. So just to be clear, we're on the same page. Okay.
No, yeah, for sure. No, I hear you. Those are separate conversations and very valid. But with the case of people, so I mean, it's an interesting conversation because the funny thing is that the psychology community is in conversation, like this is an active discussion at the moment because basically since the beginning of PTSD being a diagnosis, the theoretical framework of PTSD at the time included this concept, like there was this complex dichotomy where on one hand we said part of the symptoms of PTSD are people are experiencing intrusive thoughts and memories and like can't get away from the memory of the traumatic event, and on the other hand they forget about it.
Sure.
And so there's conversation now of us going back over that. That's been there since the beginning of the diagnosis, and we're going back over that and going, does that actually make sense? Like, is that actually happening?
For another part of this conversation, I just want to, so we don't
Please.
spend too much time on this we disagree on. I do believe that repression can happen, but I would say only in an intentional sense, not in a spooky brain sense. So, for instance, there might be a conversation that I had with a girl that was incredibly cringy, and I try my hardest not to think back on it. And maybe over the period of months or years, eventually I forget it happens, and then somebody will tell me at some point, like, "Hey, do you remember that conversation you had with Sarah? It was really cringy." And they're like, "Oh God, I remember," and it's horrible. I think that that type of repression is possible. I'm only clarifying this so they don't spend time talking like, "Oh, obviously I agree, that's a thing," right? Because I don't want to sound like I'm backpedaling later, right? But I don't believe where it's like I had a conversation, it was actually so horrible, my brain repressed it. I didn't even want to forget it, but my brain did it. And then like a few months later, somehow I'm getting triggered by things that I don't understand, I don't remember, because my brain automatically repressed this memory that I didn't even want to forget, right? So I think repression can happen to some extent on an intentional level, but not as like a spooky brain magic thing. Yeah, okay, go for it.
Yeah. Well, so I guess what I would say is that most likely this is it happens very infrequently, and so the amount of research on it is small. But that the places that is happening, I'd say you're basically hitting on it. But I would add this element of, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to talk about it without taking too many in-depth rabbit trails. But
I'm sorry, because I'm so stupid. Okay, yeah.
No.
Okay.
I'm sorry. No, just some of these conversations then take another 20 minutes.
Give us the 20 minutes. That's fine. Because when I'm on stream, okay, when you're not here, I'm saying D&D, or not D&D, I'm saying DID is some fake fucking shit, okay? It's bullshit. I read it. So this is your chance to make me look, not make me look dumb, but it's interesting because you mentioned this in the beginning, and I'm not trying to discredit you or anything. Maybe you've heard of this or not. I've heard in the beginning that one of the complaints that researchers had about the DSM-5 was some people felt like it overrepresented on the clinician side and underrepresented on the research side. And that's why I've heard some argue that that's why things like DID are in the DSM-5 and it's so highly contested. So it's interesting, not to say that what you're saying is right or wrong, but it's interesting you came in on the clinician side to defend the concept of DID. And I'm curious where the research, I guess, will end up on that. But it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, for sure. I agreed. I too am interested. Okay, so I I really like this. Okay, maybe I should start with a caveat in explaining that psychology as a field is so ridiculously full of nuance. You're never going to find psychologists do not agree on anything.
Sure.
Basically anything. So we can talk about like.
Wait, can I caveat that real quick? I'm sorry.
Please. No, do it.
I think psychologists probably agree on a whole bunch of stuff, but when it comes into the very fine nuance and weeds, you're probably going to run into a lot of discord, right? So like holistically, psychologists probably agree that like it's not good to stay in bed all day. It's not good to beat your children. It's not good to expose yourself to traumatic events over and over again, right? They're broadly agreed on a lot of things. Kind of like nutrition. Yeah. Like when people say, oh, we don't know anything about nutrition, we know a lot about nutrition. We might just not know like the optimal 100% perfect diet, but we roughly can say like you should eat this like rough group of things, right? Just so we're on the same page here?
Right.
Okay, just making sure.
But I would say that the difficulty is that, and I mean, this is going to be the same for nutritionists as it is for psychologists, is that then we're asked to apply these broad theoretical concepts to very specific people, and then we run into issues, right? It doesn't, like, no, it's probably not great to stay in bed all day, but if you have cystic fibrosis and it's incredibly painful to move, then I'm not going to necessarily go up to you and say, well, you should figure out how to get out of bed during the day when you're in crazy amounts of pain. But okay, so backtracking then, I like polyvagal theory, which is this neuroscience look at how our brain responds to basically fight or flight response. But the important aspect of that the polyvagal theory spends a lot of time talking about is the freeze response on top of that. So the idea being, and I don't take this personally if I end up seeming like I'm dumbing this down too much. This is a conversation
totally
I have a lot with clients.
Listen, half the people on the internet call me a Nazi and the other half call me a pedophile, so nothing you say is going to be as offensive as that, so don't worry, you're good. Okay. Go for it.
I talk about, opossums play dead, right? But that's not actually a choice they make. That is their nervous system overriding their body and forcing them into this death-like state.
Okay.
Humans do similar things on a spectrum. So this is the terrible, horrible example. but very salient. We hear a lot of reports of individuals speaking to incidents of sexual assault and finding themselves in the moment not being able to fight back.
Sure.
And that is your brain overloading into a freeze response.
Okay.
So in periods of stress, I'm not a neuroscientist,
Sure.
so some of this I'm vague on. But
Okay.
there's the vagus nerve, and parts of your brainstem get involved when you feel unsafe. When the brainstem part of your brain feels unsafe, which is not always like the rational frontal lobe, like actually evaluating a situation, isn't necessarily involved in that. The brainstem says, I don't feel safe in this situation. And at first, that activates like adrenaline and the fight or flight response. Do I need to fight to get out of this? Do I need to run? But then if you can't get out of it, if the brainstem determines you can't get out of it, or whatever that looks like, you can escalate into a freeze response. Sometimes that looks like actual kind of body shutdown. Like the brain and the body disconnect, and you're not really in the driver's seat anymore.
Okay. Something that I've heard about this that always looks really weird when you see this on video, but I've heard this explanation before, is if you ever watch two animals that are fighting to the death, occasionally like one will just kind of be like just standing there chilling. They might like kind of like reach down, smell the grass a little bit, and they're kind of looking around, even though like half their stomach is falling out. And you'll see a lot of comments where people are like, why is like, how is it not like in agonizing pain or screaming or whatever? And it's because that it's like that freeze response where it's just like they walk around for a little bit and they don't have yeah.
When I talk to high schoolers about this, I have the analogy. I say your brain is hitting the do not disturb button on your body really hard.
Sure.
Kind of this protection. It's an attempt. Your brain is attempting to protect you. I can't get you out of this. Your body has to be present, but you don't have to be.
Sure.
And so sometimes it looks like that. Yeah, it looks like, why aren't they screaming and reacting? Sometimes it's a lot not as intense as that. It's you kind of, and this is what I think is typically we talk about, like a more well-known psych term is calling it dissociation.
Sure.
You kind of hit the disconnect button. So your brain will kind of make decisions like that for you sometimes. Sometimes this is a helpful thing, right? When if I have a teenager that's just being screamed at for 4 hours, like I would love for them to dissociate in the middle of that. They don't have to, if they can't get out, like if you have to sit there through that, then please don't be present. Like whatever you have to do to take care of yourself in that period of time, right? But then the brain isn't always good at evaluating, like, okay, I need to do it in this really serious safety issue, but then there's something else in my day that feels similarly unsafe. And so I need to, like, I also need to disconnect there, when in reality it's like, I'm in class, I kind of need to be paying attention.
Sure.
I need to do something else to take care of this feeling of not being safe.
Because when you talk about stuff related to, especially the brainstem, all of this is like highly preceding any actual cognitive thought in your brain. It's way before any of that. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So when we circle back around to dissociative amnesia, and we talk about, so you framed it as, I can see repression, where I'm like purposefully making a choice to not think about this. I would suggest that there are instances where the brainstem gets involved in that too. And we have, like, you can dissociate to external things that feel like external to you that feel unsafe, but you can also attempt to dissociate from internal feelings of unsafety.
Sure. So, okay, so let me see. I'm going to take this and try to synthesize it into what I think you're essentially saying, right? So, in times of great stress, our brainstem, or something very, very deep in our brain, might make this decision that it's time to dissociate. We're basically shutting down because we can't deal with whatever situation in front of us. And it might be the case that activates in especially traumatic points in our life. And if that were the case, then we could theorize that there are traumatic moments in our life where we're undergoing dissociation, where we're basically not codifying anything into memory. So we're enduring some sort of traumatic event, and as a result of our brain, like, dissociating, we lose the ability to record those memories, and we just don't have a memory of them, kind of like that.
No, but I mean that's a
Okay, go ahead. Okay, hit me up for the. So where do we get to the dissociative amnesia part then? I guess
You had it all right, except I'm positing that later in the moment, I don't think it's possible to dissociate enough to not encode the event. I think the event is in there. I think you have the memory, but I think that later on, the remembering of the event is so internally stressful that your brain avoids remembering the event.
Okay, so it's almost like a hybrid of like we choose not to remember it and we don't choose not to remember it because it's so traumatic. So it's kind of like somewhere stuck in the middle there. Sure.
So when we talk about forgetting, I don't think that the memory is actually gone. I think that we lose the ability to pull it to the forefront of our brain.
Sure. So I think that when given this account of a like dissociative amnesia, I think I can get really close to buying that. And I will admit that it's perhaps me falling victim to sensational stories. I think the problem that I run into is that oftentimes, and psychology students are not I don't mean you, but like obviously when we tell stories, right? Like, well, how do we talk about the brain? Well, let's talk about Phineas Gage, who had a fucking thing launched, right? We always talk about the most sensational stories, right? Right. When people talk about DID, it often comes in the case of like, oh, I forgot like all of these events, like there's a whole other world. It's not just a singular traumatic event where I think this explanation I could almost get on board with, but it's like a huge collection of things, like a whole other world that you've kind of buried in your mind. And then that makes it harder for me, I think, to get on board with that. Because it seems like we're at a much more like cognitive level of connecting a whole bunch of different things together that are like highly symbolic. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
No, for sure. And that's so. Then talking about circling to DID with that, I do think I think you're right. I think it does get a lot more complicated. There is, I got really curious in planning to have this conversation, and I did research, and I found a really interesting article where they did. So there's two different kinds of remembering. There's retrieval and there's recall. Okay. Retrieval being, you say like. What did you have for breakfast this morning? And you have to pull up from all of the things you've ever eaten for breakfast. This morning I had a bagel. Versus recall being, I'm going to give you a list of 3 things. One of the things is going to be correct. Which one is it?
Yeah, and our recall is so good and our retrieval is so bad. So the example I was given in psych class for this is like, if I were to tell you to list every movie or video game or show you've ever played, you might get less than half. You might But if I give you a list of everything you've ever seen, you'll get like 99% or whatever. Yeah, the way I remember. Yeah, okay, I know what you're talking about. Go ahead.
Exactly. So they did a study with, I don't remember the number. It was small on the DID persistent side, fairly understandably. They took individuals with at least who identified as having at least 2 different personalities. They took individuals that they prepped and trained and asked them to pretend that they had a DID, and then they took normal participants. And they asked them, they showed different personalities, different stimulus, and then they went back and they asked the other personality, do you remember? They asked them to retrieve what personality A was exposed to. And then they asked the other personality what to recall what the other person, right? So it was like just tell me what it was that your other personality was exposed to, and then like pick, like here's a list of option A or B, which one did personality A get exposed to? They were really bad at retrieval, but they were actually pretty decent at recall, like significantly better at recall than the individuals who were faking having DID and the normal participants. Okay. Well, and the normal participants didn't have like another stimulus. That one was it, but yeah. So there seems to be evidence that consciously these individuals don't remember the events, but it is there. I don't have a cognitive explanation for that. I have no idea. Sure. But this is I don't think the research is out there yet, and I
which is fair. We don't have like a neurobiological explanation for a lot of like psychological, I guess, like concepts.
Many of it.
What how do you fit like the idea of multiple personalities into this? Yeah.
Ooh, okay. This stuff I get excited about. Okay, so first I would tell you that we know jack shit about personality.
Okay.
We have really great tests to measure the expression of personality,
Mm-hmm.
like really great ones, and we use them all the time. But what a personality actually is has been in debate since like pre-Aristotle. Like
Sure.
we just have no concept. So when we talk about, so there's a couple of different theories that are operated upon on what personality is and what it looks like. And I would tell you, and this might be very unsatisfying to you, as a clinician, I end up operating from the position of all of them work clinically. And so I am happy to work with any of the theories if it seems to apply well to the client in front of me.
Sure, because we're not really looking to solve or like do something at some fundamental biological level. We're basically just
Right.
treating these as different frameworks or lenses through which we can analyze problems and then work
Exactly.
towards solutions. So you'd pick the best tool for the best. Yeah, okay, sure.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So one of the operating theories on personality, I don't think this is the official term for it, but it's the one I've pieced together. Is the concept of the braided self.
Okay.
It's this idea that you are, as a person, an amalgamation or a weaving together of you as you were at basically all of the points in time in your life. Who you are now is you as a 6-year-old and a 25-year-old and a 28-year-old and it's you in different emotional states. It's you angry and sad. And so different points in time in our life are going to draw upon different threads of this personality. I picture a yachting rope. You know, the yachting ropes that are woven together of like 25 pieces of thread versus like 3.
Gotcha.
One of the best so different points in time in your life are going to pull on different pieces of this thread of your
Do
personality.
you ever feel
Okay.
like an NPC?
One of the great examples I have of this as like you seen any of the, I'm sure you have, the videos of adults, like you think like the quintessential internet video right now of an adult 50-year-old man throwing a fit about being told to wear a mask in a grocery store and like throwing themselves on the floor and being dragged out of the store.
I understand what you're saying. I have a lot of customer service experience. Well, before I got into streaming, and I view like most adults that way, as acting that way all the time. But I understand what you're saying. Yeah. Okay.
So sometimes, presumably, that at least for the number of people that we see these videos of, these are individuals who have functional jobs, right? In other places in their life, they're a functioning adult. But sometimes you hit on something that pulls out the 6-year-old in them. And they throw a 6-year-old temper tantrum. And this theory of personality talks about the idea that in some ways we're literally pulling on the 6-year-old in them.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. I don't think I buy this one, but I understand where you're coming from. Is the next stage of this that basically, if we look at somebody with DID, there might be a series or a connection of disjointed things that we've repressed that in certain emotional states we can draw from, which essentially kind of creates the illusion of a separate personality? Or
No. Or this isn't, and this is I'm going to be honest in that a lot of this is coming from me and my understanding rather than,
like a publisher? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, this isn't a topic that's talked about too much. But the idea being, okay, so we are working on the DSM-5 is constantly in flux, right? This is not a finished concept, and there's a lot of changes that are being discussed right now, especially around things like personality disorders, for example. There's a lot of change coming to that structure.
That they were going to undo or get away, I think, from the whole like cluster A, cluster B thing or something, or there's and then homosexuality used to be considered a paraphilia instead of like there's a lot of
Yes. Technically, there is a section of the DSM-5 that still applies to cross-dressing, which is hugely problematic.
Oh God, I am so triggered that you just said that word when talking about the DSM. But okay, go ahead.
I know, I'm triggered. I said it. It's a huge problem.
Sure. It's scary that some of the it's not to sidestep into the most controversial topics, especially
please.
after it's sometimes it's frightening to me that some of the diagnostic criteria are a little bit more beholden to like social values rather than
Yes.
like more accurate description. The thing that I think of the most is when we talk about like what is a paraphilia versus like a sexual orientation, and you break down something like pedophilia versus like homosexuality, where it feels like, based on everything I've seen or from the clinical evidence, it seems like both of these function similarly in some regards, that they're very hard to change in therapy. You can't take a gay person and make them ungay, much the same way that you can't take a pedophile and make them an unpedophile. That seems to be the case from everything I've seen from like conversion therapy. But they're treated and classified totally differently, so people therefore have a totally different view of them. Yeah, okay, well, she Vaushed me. Oh, sorry. I'm just kidding.
Turned off.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like people have a vastly different view of them because of how they're classified, even if it seems like the underpinnings of these might be relatively similar, but because socially one is like, for good reasons, like not accepted, and the other one is for good reasons accepted, we try to pretend that they're fundamentally very different, even if they might arise in similar ways from the brain or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily want to go down this train either, but a couple of steps I think is cool. Interestingly,
sure. Or how about a safer one? I've heard some people will
Yeah.
criticize a lot of cluster B related personality disorders. Freud didn't do us any favors here, but because a lot of these seem to be overdiagnosed in women, or they're more prevalent on the woman's side, people will say, well, are you pathologizing what might be, sometimes women might get emotional or something, but you're calling this histrionic, or you're calling this borderline or something. So I worry sometimes, like, well, we need to get rid of these, mental illnesses. Like, well, is it a mental illness? Is it a personality disorder? Or like, it seems really hard to figure out, how do you figure this out scientifically, free of cultural influence? You can't do it. How much is too much? Yeah, that just seems really difficult.
Oh yeah, no, I mean 100%. There was a philosopher, was it Faust? I don't know. He wrote a book called, it was something in punishment. I don't know. I was given the quote, not the book, but he basically called psychologists the prison guards of society, in place to keep the people in power and to decide who is socially acceptable in society or not, according to the designs of the people in power. And yeah, I mean, no, I am all for this criticism of psychologists. I am right there. Yes, it's a huge problem. Something that is still being worked on, for sure. But
sorry, I drew you really far off of this. You were talking about the braided threads that we draw on from personality, dissociative amnesia, and then I thought, I guess, where you were going with it, but then you said no, that's not at all where I was going to go.
Okay, yeah. So we're working on our trauma spectrum, trauma response spectrum, right? On one end, so as it is right now in the DSM-5, you've got like acute stress response, and then you've got PTSD. If you go look at I don't know if you ever heard the
Wait,
ICD-11.
what's so cute about a stress response? I'm so sorry. That's the only one of those I'm ever going to make. Okay, you have an acute stress response, and then you've got PTSD. Go for it, which is a longer-term chronic stress response. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. If you look at the ICD-11, I haven't heard that come up in any of your site conversations yet, so I don't know if you've engaged with that.
Is that
one
like
at all.
some inventory? I don't know what the fuck. What is the ICD?
It's basically the international it's the international something of disease.
Okay. The International Classification of Diseases, 11th revision. Okay.
Thank you. So that's got the more international version of the DSM-5 smushed into it.
Okay.
They have a different set of diagnoses, right? So DSM-5 has gotten rid of Asperger's. ICD-11 still has Asperger's. ICD-11 also has this newer diagnosis called complex PTSD.
CPSD, yeah, everybody. The PTSD was too boring, so everybody on Twitter has this one now. So go ahead.
Yeah, yes. No, it's.
I'm not saying it's not real. I'm sorry, but nowadays it's not enough. Everybody has to amp their shit up. Nobody has PTSD anymore. That's for fucking losers. Okay, that just means that you cry when you hear a car backfire. Now you have CPTSD. Okay, it's complex. This means that everything fucking ruins. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm so online. Go ahead. Sorry, talk to me about it. Okay, go ahead. Tell us.
Yes. So complex PTSD, not in the DSM-5 yet. I think it will be, probably. I could be completely wrong on that, but enough clinicians are really interested in this diagnosis. And I think it makes a hell of a lot of sense.
Sure.
There's also current conversations about taking borderline personality disorder and attaching that on the end of the trauma response spectrum. I think it's a little interesting to separate, I agree with it, but I think at that point we need to put all personality disorders at the end of the trauma response spectrum. You're not really going to get the concrete what a personality disorder is not really well talked about in the rest of the culture. I don't even think it's really well talked about among a lot of clinicians. I think that's a diagnostic category that is talked about a lot at the I don't know. I don't even know if I want to go down this road. There's weird crossovers and gaps or differences in training and conversations between master's level clinicians and doctoral level clinicians, and there's weird shifts in the culture of the guild in what is the responsibility of who, and at what training level. So some of this is very much in flux. But
maybe I've heard as an example, so something that I hear a lot from people that are doing clinical work is the idea that like sometimes you don't really work in a diagnosis. You would never tell a person if you suspect one because it's not helpful. And sometimes the only one that I've heard an exception for is borderline. People that are perceived as being borderline can be very scary to work with, and a lot of clinicians won't do that for a variety of reasons. But yeah.
Yes, I have had. I have had clients come in and say, I have a diagnosis of borderline, please treat me. Like, I know that that's scary, please treat. And I said, yeah, I'm gonna treat you. Gosh, I'm not saying.
So from a personal level,
yes.
I really don't, if I was a doctor, doctors are so much easier than psychologists. I don't mean that necessarily, but like, I can scan your body and look for a tumor, but I don't have to rely as much on your self-reporting. But if I was working in a clinical environment and somebody came in and they said, I have X disease, or personality, I feel like I would never want to treat that person. Because if their self-assessment is incorrect, I feel like you have to spend so much time trying to move them off of that. And then I would have to start to wonder how many of their behaviors were self-inflicted. My son has horrible ADHD. And when I was doing the research for it, I started to notice a lot of things where it's like, I didn't know this was part of ADHD, and I kind of wondered for myself. And then something I kept wondering was like, if I was to go in to get a diagnosis for ADHD, I wouldn't even trust myself to do it because I know the responses that I should give to be more indicative of it. And this is with me being super cognizant of it. I couldn't imagine if I was like a little bit less aware and I was like, oh yeah, I do. It's like the, there's actually a name for psych students where when you read something in a book, you start
self-diagnosing. Yes.
that concept of all, and I like that more information is available to people, but that concept of reading all about a mental illness and then going to talk to somebody about what you think you have, that actually seems like the most mind poisoning thing you could ever do.
Right. Yeah. No, it gets super complicated. People come into my clinic for assessments and they're like, I want to get tested for ADHD. And I have to explain, I can't test for ADHD. I test for everything. And if ADHD pops up, great. If not, like, I'm gonna have to tell you what I find. And this, it does get interesting. And that's, so, I mean, you're hitting on an interesting point because, so the DSM-5, it's not from psychologists. It's from psychiatrists. And that, I think, is part of the root for why there's such a disconnect and why there's such complexity around how we use the DSM-5.
I thought for different parts of the DSM-5, I thought there was a lot of different like coordination that goes into.
Yes, as it is in a modern day setting, there's plenty of collaboration and coordination. The origins of the diagnostic model that the DSM-5 is based off of comes from psychiatrists. Like our entire structure of diagnosis as it is right now comes from a medical model. Like psychiatrists go to med school. And so it is kind of like you talked about, right? You do a scan for a tumor, right? You go into the doctor, you say, here's my list of symptoms, right? And then the doctor does a test and looks and sees, oh, look, you have COVID molecules, right? You have COVID, right? We found the root cause that are causing these symptoms. And there's like important, and I'm not going to demean that at all. There's incredible complications in that, right? But we did the same structure for psychological diagnoses, right? People come into there seems to be a predominance of people coming, like a statistically significant number of people come in talking about feelings of hopelessness and changes in their sleep pattern and eating pattern and weight, and they don't enjoy things they used to enjoy. This seems to be a common theme. We're going to call it depression, and we're going to assume that at the root of all of these symptoms is the same thing.
Sure.
really interesting research that is still very much in the beginning stages, but just kind of came out within the last year or two. They started doing a bunch of MRI scans on individuals with depression. It looks like there might actually be 7 different kinds of depression.
Sure. So this reminds me kind of a lot of the discussions around autism that, especially as we've grouped more and more things into autism. So you mentioned earlier about Asperger's, right? It's no longer, that's not a thing anymore now. We just call it all autism spectrum disorder.
Right.
And
right.
Even
but
for
only
that,
in the DSM-5.
Yeah.
If your insurance works with ICD-11, then you have Asperger's.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. But even when it comes to ASD, people aren't sure if that's one disease, a collection of diseases, if it arises from, people aren't sure how much is genetically influenced, versus.
Right. And then I'll be honest, our testing for ASD is dog shit. Excuse me.
Depending on the severity, I guess, of what we're talking about. If it's extreme,
Yes.
I think early on it seems like it's a bit more.
Yes. Yeah. Depending on where you would quote unquote fall on that spectrum, our testing is more or less helpful. Anyways, going back 8 steps, where were we?
Psychologists wanted to treat things like like diseases, like medicine, like doctors.
Medical model versus So we don't. But how was I connecting that back to DID and trauma? Trauma response was the important part, and then we ended up on some sidetrack. If you don't mind, I'm going to go all the way back to the trauma response spectrum.
Yep, go
because
for it.
I don't remember how we got there.
I think you said we were doing a lot of work on re-understanding trauma responses. You brought up CPTSD, which was part of the the DI whatever 11 and not the DSM.
Yes, ICD-11. Yes. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I had a long day of work before this.
No, you're fine.
But so okay, so now I'm gonna pull in with I'm going to attempt to explain some of these trauma responses, these traumatic response diagnoses from the framework of this concept of the braided self.
Okay.
So if we picture this yachting rope, right, that is your personality and development of as a person over time, right? When you're super young, like you don't have a theory of mind, like you don't. There's a word starts with a T. It's not personality. It's a tendencies. I don't remember.
Okay.
Most of your personality isn't fully developed yet. You've got tendencies that are starting to show up and stuff like that. But we don't really have a sense of self. We don't really have a personality yet. And over time, we start to kind of create pieces of these thread that we're weaving together to create this template and pattern for who you are and your personality. And you think about this person goes through life, has... I should preface that from this concept of the braided self, a lot of it is framed coming out of psychodynamic therapy. So Freud, big, weird, scary name for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. But the idea being that the more tightly woven you have all of these aspects of yourself, the healthier you are.
Okay.
And what we see is that people without this sort of integration of self have greater shifts in personality depending on the stimulus and the stress they're going through in life. And we see different pieces of personality get pulled out and pretty dramatic shifts in temperament.
Okay. Oh, was temperament, was that the word you were looking for earlier?
Oh, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe. I don't remember.
You were looking for a T word, but okay, yeah, go for it.
I was. You're right. Okay, so you're going along in life. You've got this decently tightly woven yachting rope that is you, and then you have a pretty traumatic incident. I don't know. We can come up with something. It's a singular incident. You get in a car crash and someone dies in the car crash.
Okay.
Horrible, not fun. And this creates like this big knot in the knotting rope. Like there's this sudden instance of things getting unwoven and knotted together. But with some solid work over time, you're able to refine the weave template again and come back together and move forward at least similar to where you were previously. There's
Okay.
probably going to be some changes, but you had a solid framework from the beginning, so it's not too hard to put yourself back together and keep going afterwards.
Okay.
Maybe we take out the someone died part. Just go with like a pretty traumatic car accident.
Sure.
I don't know. So my screen keeps turning. Okay. Then we go for so that might be so you get in a car accident, but and no one gets hurt. And for the next 2 weeks, it's a little hard to drive. Like, you're pretty anxious about getting in the car and driving. Maybe that affects your ability to go to work for the next, like, 2 weeks. That might be what you call, like, an acute stress response.
Okay.
So it was impactful. It affects your ability to function for the next couple of weeks, but you pull yourself back together and you're able to kind of keep moving.
Okay.
A PTSD event, an event that might spark PTSD for someone, this is a more significant event. And your brain does a little bit of rewiring in the process of that, and you have some ongoing intrusive symptoms, intrusive thoughts or memories. You have some reactions to, you're more likely to, normal everyday things cause you to feel like you're unsafe, and you have pretty significant reactions to try and put yourself into a safe situation out of that. PTSD is not nearly as common as people think it is. It's something only like 30% of active military veterans will receive a PTSD diagnosis. And it's also thrown around a lot when it's not useful.
Yeah, a lot of the language of psychologists and trauma, I feel, have been kind of co-opted by broader conversations.
I have a PTSD from my ex-boyfriend. Unless your boyfriend threatened you with a knife and you thought you were going to die, I don't think you have PTSD.
Sure. Or, yeah, because it seems like we can't really have, nothing bad can happen to you anymore. It either had to have been, like, abusive or traumatizing, or, yeah, we use these words a lot, yeah.
Yeah, or a lot of me and my classmates, kind of tongue-in-cheek, we joke about big T trauma versus little T trauma.
Yeah, sure. But that you can't. That's a really hard conversation to have publicly, though, obviously. Yeah.
No, yeah, that's I'm not necessarily suggesting everyone adopt that.
Yeah. Something I will say though that this is my personal psychology research. I don't have a strict term for this though. I do wonder sometimes. There's a term that I use called retroactive trauma, where I do wonder if people can retroactively traumatize themselves in situations by convincing themselves that it was traumatic. The best example I can think of, and I'm sure there's a million examples like this, is a girl. There were two girls, two guys that were playing a game of D&D on Twitch. Do you know Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah.
And in one of there was an encounter where the DM did something that was like, it was like a little creepy and kind of dumb, and he shouldn't have done it. Basically, like, the girl was playing like a robot character, and another character like tricked the robot into like having like an orgasm chip. It was a quick joke. It was stupid. You probably shouldn't have done it. And like, I could tell at the time just watching. Now I can't see what's in her mind, but it seemed like she thought it was kind of awkward. They kind of like, oh, that's kind of weird. And they laughed it off. And over the next couple of days, there was like an uproar on Twitter. People were so mad. They called it
I
like...
think my partner told me about this.
Maybe, yeah, it was a big deal. And there was a guy that got almost like completely canceled. It was like basically people saying like, you e-raped her. It was horrible. And then when she came out with a response, she seemed like really bothered at that point. Now, I don't know if that was in response to the social backlash or what, but it was like, it feels like sometimes the example I always use, and I hate to treat adults like children, but like, I have a son who's 10 years old. When he was a kid, this is something I've noticed for kids for a long time. If your kid runs into a table and you say like, hey, you okay? That's cool. Get up. Let's go. You're fine. But if you overreact to it, the child will always he'll mirror your reaction. So moms, not to be sexist, tend to do this, where a kid will run into something and you'll hear like the from the mom, and it'll be like, oh my God. And as soon as the child hears that, you can see the child's eyes get really big. Yeah, and it's like, oh my God, stop. But I wonder sometimes if people can do that too, to where you have things that aren't genuinely traumatic, but they've been like so socially conditioned over it that it like becomes a traumatic thing. And it's like, oh my God. Yeah.
Well, and I think I don't know. I will say that I think some of that gets complicated too with how we so often our society, we work really hard often in our society to avoid the feeling of uncomfortable emotions, right? Like emotions come with physical sensations.
Yeah.
and people work really hard to avoid that, right? And like we put a lot of effort into it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I feel there's a complicated balance, the both and, right? Where I could definitely see that happening, for sure. And I could also see at the same time people in the moment being uncomfortable. Later, for whatever reason, whether because people tell them they should be uncomfortable or because or they take more time to think about it, they actually allow themselves to feel how uncomfortable they were. And I could definitely see also in that instance kind of cycling on it and making it bigger than it would have been if they had just been uncomfortable in the moment.
Sure. And I can
Like,
see both ends of that too. Like
Yeah.
there are times where somebody might think an experience was normal and it wasn't, and it is worth
Right.
thinking about.
Right.
Yeah, that definitely happens. Although something that is so important, and it's hard to say this without sounding like I think sometimes adults get into this weird world where they're like, I suffered in some way and now you have to suffer too, almost like a hazing mentality. And I don't think that's true, but the obsession with avoiding any sort of negative feeling, I think the lack of resiliency sometimes that develops as a result of that, or the inability, like you can no longer have any challenging emotional states ever. All of them are to be avoided. And then you end up in this world where you're over accommodating people, where people don't realize like, well, accommodations, even for people that have trauma, can be negative, right? But over accommodating is like is a disease almost in and of itself. You'll fuck with somebody who's really hard. But now we massively try, like when people are putting trigger warnings on world history classes, it's like, well, hold on, wait a second. Like what like a normal human being should be able to endure a history course without getting triggered. Like something is wrong there, at that point. Yeah. That's really negative. Yeah.
I end up spending a fair bit of time like working with clients talking about like, hey, like let's acknowledge that going to therapy sucks. I'm here. Like part of my job is to make you really uncomfortable, and like I'm going to support you through it, and like I'm going to try to give you as much support and prep as you need before we do this. But like we're here to kind of lance the wound.
Sure.
And that sucks. It feels really uncomfortable. Yeah, and so that's ends up being a lot of what I do with clients is like, hey, like you tell me that's okay, but I know it's not okay. We need to stop and like ride that emotion wave and feel really uncomfortable for a little bit before you're ready to like move on and actually be okay.
Yeah.
I feel like
and
I'm
just
outpacing
acknowledging that like
intellectually.
I don't know. You use the word too, and I'm not critiquing you on that at all. This is society uses this words. We talk about negative emotions, and I get why we talk about that, but I don't think any emotions are negative. I think there are emotions that are uncomfortable, but all emotions are our body trying to communicate something to us.
Sure.
And I don't think there are. I don't know. You can argue me on that if you like, but I don't think there are any negative emotions. There's
Well, I mean, we probably agree that there are some negative emotions. So, like a negative emotion, I think a trauma response by definition would probably be a negative emotion because it's an emotion that we try to seek to remove because we realize that it's negative. So when our body is giving us a response that doesn't map onto reality very well, or causes us to have a maladaptive behavior, that's something that through CBT or some other framework we're going to try to like get rid of because we realize that emotion doesn't serve anything positively, right? Maybe? I don't know, or maybe you wouldn't call that a negative emotion.
So I mean, some of this I think is going to be a semantic conversation,
Sure.
and like I'm going to acknowledge that, right? But like I would say, it's not the emotion that's negative in that moment; it's your reaction to the emotion. What do you do with it?
Sure. But isn't part like so if we're working through like a CBT framework, isn't our goal to change the reaction so that we can change the thought so that we can change the feeling eventually? Isn't that kind of the goal? So like let's say every time we see a man and we're scared of a man because of a traumatic experience we had earlier in life with men, we would recognize that this is a bad emotion, our thoughts about it are bad, and our reaction to it is bad. Well, if we can slowly change our reactions, we can have different thoughts, and then eventually we can get rid of that emotion. We don't want to feel scared every time we see a man. Don't we try to remove some emotions that cause maladaptive behaviors?
I mean, I guess, and I do think this is
Getting kind of semantic, yeah.
Or it's going to be clinical semantics, yeah. But I would say I'm not trying to. I would say likely, if you're scared every time you see a man, you're scared because you haven't worked through the trauma yet. You haven't worked through why you're scared of a man. And so I'm not really looking to, my goal isn't, if you come to me and say, like, I have a boss who's a dude, I need to not be scared of him anymore, I need to function, then, like, yes, I'm gonna, like, in that point, the goal is changing the fear, or at least reducing the fear. But even in that, I don't think the fear is bad in and of itself. I
Sure.
think it's making your life really complicated, and I think we need to change that. But I think that the fear is your body kind of letting you know, hey, like, that's your brainstem saying, other times you've been in situations like this, they were really unsafe. I think we need to be really careful here.
Yeah. I think
so
I can kind of agree. The only thing I'll put, I think in a conversation with you, I would agree. The only reason I would push back on that, broadly speaking, is I'm sure you've heard this, that like you can understand something without condoning it, right?
Yeah.
It feels like we've moved away from that. Now, if you understand something, you're necessarily condoning it. So when we talk about like somebody might be afraid in a certain situation, the suggestion that maybe that feeling ought to change is oftentimes met with hostility, kind of because of the reason you said earlier, is because it's necessarily going to introduce some uncomfortable thoughts.
It's going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's going to suck.
Whereas if you accommodate it forever and you say, well, it's not negative, that's just how my body does, blah, blah, blah. But I understand that's not how you're using it. So like in a conversation with you, I wouldn't mind describing it. Yeah, but I could see how other people
No,
would.
that's valid.
Yeah.
That's part of this having a conversation in front of the internet is weird. It definitely changes some of the context.
But I understand what you mean. Anything that you have a quote unquote negative thing is technically an opportunity for growth, or there's something that you're not addressing, right? We wouldn't call like a pain in your body a negative pain and try to ignore it. We would say, well, what's causing the pain? We need to fix this.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Yeah. I think we're on the same page with that. But wow, that was really sidetracked. Where were we?
So doctors analyze things in a certain way, and they wanted psychologists to do it. You were talking about
trauma responses.
Trauma
we were
responses,
talking about the braided self in response
braided
to
self.
trauma.
Yes.
Right. And we were talking about PTSD, and we were talking about
PTSD. Got it. Yeah, and they were talking about. Okay, yep.
So yeah. PTSD. So PTSD very commonly occurs in reaction to an event. You have a event. Pretty specifically in the DSM-5, it lists that like that event causes you on both like a frontal lobe, like rational thinking, and a brainstem part to think you're going to die. Like this is a very traumatic event, but it's like it's one event. Complex PTSD comes in when we talk about people who are experiencing recurrent events. So we think about individuals in abusive families or abusive relationships, where we have ongoing trauma. And the idea being that this concept of the braided self, you have this knot come up, and the knot lasts for a while. And when you come out of, eventually, hopefully, you're able to get out of that situation, and you're no longer experiencing these traumatic events. And that pretty drastically changes the weave of your yachting rope. Coming out of that, so the idea being, so if we're gonna come up with hypothetical situations, some of this is gross, dark, not fun talk, but I think it's important and relevant. We talk about so if I'm gonna come up with like a situation ripe for creating complex trauma, right? I might think about someone who an adolescent, maybe 15 years old, who starts experiencing sexual assault in her home for a number of years, right? You come out of that, and I would not be surprised in that point to see complex trauma, right?
Sure.
We've seen there's a pretty drastic like personality change after that point. It's PTSD with a personality change is often how complex trauma is described. Now take that situation and move it back to when an individual is like 3 or 4 or 5. At this point in time, they haven't had the chance to form their yachting rope yet.
Mm-hmm.
In this instance, where they don't yet have a sense of self before they start experiencing ongoing, significantly traumatic events for years, maybe a decade or more, in that instance, they're not able to form a yachting rope. And in that instance, I can see individuals, instead of weaving these strings together, they form individual strings, but they all run alongside each other rather than interweaving.
Gotcha.
And so we get what is functionally separate personalities.
Okay. I'm hearing what you're saying, and it is internally consistent. I just totally don't buy into it, but I understand what you're saying. I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it gets complicated.
Mm-hmm.
The DSM-5 is pretty consistent in saying that DID seems to come out of significant ongoing childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
There is interesting, I was like, oh, that's weird. I don't know how I feel about that. There was conversation that there seems to be instances of children who aren't experiencing abuse, but experience early childhood, what we would call medical trauma.
Okay.
Like they have a long period of really intense medical treatments
Mm-hmm.
that cause a lot of dissociation from their own body.
Okay.
And disconnect. And some of those individuals, they're according to the DSM-5, there are reports and cases of individuals coming out of situations like that with cases of DID. I don't know. I that seemed to be more the minority. It seemed to be that the cases that were coming out were individuals who experienced significant, long-term, recurrent childhood abuse starting from a very, very early age. And that this causes that they're not given the opportunity to develop a personality the way other individuals do.
Mm-hmm.
And their brain comes up with a coping mechanism. And lets individual strands of personality become separate existing things rather than interweaving them into one cohesive whole.
Gotcha. Okay. I think I understand. I understand what you're telling me. Sure. Okay.
Well, and I would, I'm certainly not going to come on and talk about any specific cases of people saying they have it or don't have it on the internet. I have absolutely no concept.
Sure.
I would say that this is going to be incredibly rare.
Mm-hmm.
That is.
Yeah, like the Discord servers or the TikTok servers full of hundreds of kids that all have. Yeah, it's probably something else is going on. But sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd say that we have that a lot. There's a lot of diagnoses that the symptoms overlap.
Mm-hmm.
A lot. I think about how it is really, weirdly, it's really hard to diagnose the difference between ADHD and a trauma response.
Sure.
They end up looking really similar, and it gets really complicated.
Oh, I noticed that there were, for my own son's behaviors, autism and ADHD even seem to have some overlap as well, even some of the ways that they would treat it, yeah.
Yes. Another common one for a while was ADHD and childhood bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. That had a lot of weird overlaps where we suddenly, by childhood bipolar became a bit of a fad diagnosis, and we had a spurt of childhood bipolar diagnoses. Mm-hmm. It kind of jumped up pretty high. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, I don't know if I have anything more on DID to see. DID to say, excuse me.
It seems like there's still a fair bit of disagreement or lack of consensus or explanation on what does it mean to dissociate or derealize or depersonalize. I've heard all three of these kind of used to describe similar or different things. Do you have any, in terms of differentiating between these three things, or do you feel like these are still things that people are trying to understand, or?
Yes. I mean, I think we're not done understanding anything. So I don't, which, sorry, I know that's kind of a throwaway response.
No,
but,
yeah, that's fine.
I mean, I would say that probably I'm gonna say this, acknowledging that I'm a baby psychologist. So, but I would say probably the difference between the three is going like dissociation, derealization, depersonalization is going to be a matter of how just kind of quirks of how your brain and body experience what is probably functionally pretty similar at its root. I think it's all going to be that kind of vagus nerve. We can't get out of this situation, so you're not going to be present. And how that expresses itself is probably just going to be specific to the context, specific to you and your brain. I don't know. Is that addressing your question? I'm not sure.
I was kind of curious who you're talking about, because I know that it's hard to talk about, or I'm just, yeah. It's just interesting because a lot of the underpinnings, like I said, of the DID stuff, like what is dissociation, what is dissociative amnesia, are all like seem to be like all kind of in flux in terms of our understanding of them. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think in some ways, I think that things like dissociation isn't really that closely linked to DID. I think that's something everyone does, depending on the circumstances. That's kind of, you've got a spectrum of responses to it.
Yeah. Well, I guess it kind of depends on what we call dissociation. Yeah. Because I've had moments in my life where I might feel, maybe I would describe it as dissociation, where I'm like a little zoned out or disconnected. After I had a really big drug experience when I was 30, though, in the following year, I would have panic attacks. And after those panic attacks, I would experience dissociation. And that feeling was unlike anything nothing even is remotely similar to it.
No, for sure.
So it's interesting listening to like the different, like, you know, what is dissociation? What is depersonalization? What is derealization? Is there an overlap?
Right.
Are some of these like diagnostically important to DID? Or it's hard to tell what exists on a spectrum and what doesn't because of our of our fundamental inability to ever actually tell anybody about an experience we have. So it's hard to know what is what is what for an experience. Yeah.
Yes, and this isn't something, it's not necessarily salient or great for us to try and induce these states inside of an MRI machine. So
yeah, but I wish we could sometimes because or even force people, because it's frustrating sometimes to talk about certain things. I think that I don't think it's controversial to say this, but I feel like one of the biggest horrible feelings for any sort of mental illness is the inability for other people to understand what you're feeling, because depression, especially, but probably a whole host of other mental illnesses as well, especially like ones that like are like have psychosis involved in them. Nobody, if they haven't felt it, they truly are like, you can guess, but you don't really understand it. And I think there's a lot of isolation feeling that goes into like having something and nobody around you understands it, and they're kind of waiting for you to get over it. And that's very, 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 very frustrating. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The isolation. That's what. There's an older study, but it's got like 1998 or something like that. This guy was doing a study in what factors seem to contribute most to success in talk therapy, and he came up with this pie graph, basically, that was that talked about it was something. Honestly, 40% of the pie graph, 40% of what seems to be important and like load on to having successful therapeutic, like talk therapy treatment, was the effort, willingness, and external circumstances surrounding the client and their interest in engaging with therapy. The next 20% was client-therapist rapport. It was how good the relationship was between the client and the therapist.
Sure.
Like the best tip I have for people in finding a therapist is like, if you don't really like them within the first like 15-20 minutes, enough that you're like super excited or comfortable to come back for an hour every week to talk with them, then like you should probably go find a different therapist. Like there's a lot of research that says how well you like your therapist in like the first session points really strongly to how well therapy is going to go in the long run.
Yeah, that's not surprising at all.
So there's a lot of like half of my training is like what does it look like to authentically build a relationship, like an important, solid, but weirdly one-sided relationship with someone in an hour a week.
I was gonna say this. The thing that sucks the most about this too is this is absolutely unhealthy practice for therapists themselves, because this has got to lead to like the worst kind of caretaker burnout. Because the reality is, it might be over half of the people that you see won't recover or get better or make progress. And if you are working on building genuine connections with people, that's gonna like start to like there's gonna be an accumulated scarring there of negative, which is
We get this conversation a lot. It's there's solid possibility for we were talking about like re-traumatization and stuff. There's it's not unfortunately not uncommon to see there's a technical term for it, but it's like vicarious trauma. Yes. Therapists will can, if they're not careful, experience vicarious trauma, where they end up kind of taking on the trauma responses of their clients. That's our field does a lot of conversations on what is self-care, and it's like an ethical mandate actually in our guild. Like, you have to be doing self-care, and you have to be working on it pretty hard. I would say that you said something that I had a thought about. And now it's gone.
We were talking about building a rapport with your clients.
Yeah.
And
you said trauma, burnout.
Yeah, and I mentioned this has got to be the worst practice. Yeah.
Yeah. That, and then like you can't talk about what you're talking about all day because it's all confidential, right? So it is a weird experience where I sit for hours a day and I talk with people about the hardest and most painful experiences of their life, and then I go home to my partner and I can't say anything.
From an ethics point of view, aren't you allowed to talk about anything you want as long as you don't attach a real name to it?
Complicated.
Okay, because I've heard that, like, because when you read like case studies, you'll get like real cases, but as long as you use an anonymous name. But I guess if it can be tied back to your patient, maybe it gets a little bit more murky, right?
Yeah, well, and that's so complicated, and there's conversation, like the conversation around case studies is changing a lot too, because there have been instances where someone will release a case study and the client will find the case study and will not get issues because of how their therapist talked about them in the case study, because the therapist's name is on it, right? And probably no matter how much you take out personal identifying information or change information in the case study, like, if it's going to be an accurate case study, the client is going to be able to recognize themselves in the paper. And there being issues with clients recognizing themselves and feeling really hurt or offended or betrayed.
Sure. Although at that point, I feel like you could almost blame the client, where it's like, maybe if you have these issues, you shouldn't be reading stuff like this as a possibility, because there's probably very few unique clients, right? So it's like, I am doing a case study on a girl that was sexually abused by her father when she was 9 years old. There's probably a lot of, unfortunately, people that could read that and relate to it and think like, oh my God, is this about me? Like, not, like, so I don't know how valid that is. Yeah. Maybe in truly unique cases it can be, but
I mean, I think that most of the time you're going to end up involving enough nuance that at some point you're going to be able to know that you're the 9-year-old.
Sure, depending upon, like in our 4th session, they brought up this thing and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, sure.
Right. Or like how the pace of how rapport went, or like what treatment we used and how they responded to it and stuff. And I mean, most of the time you're not, I mean, I think that actually, here's the more valid point probably, you're probably not releasing a case study on the thing you see every day.
Oh, true. It's not going to be a run-of-the-mill story. It's going to be an exceptional one. Sure.
Like, that's why it's going to be a case study versus, like you're doing a case study because you have to do a case study because there's not enough of this specific not representation, but presentation to do like a formal study on it. If you had 12 people, you could actually just do a study and then de-identify all of it and have numbers to talk about rather than a case study. So your conversation ethics, PHI, private or personal health information, private health information, but it's really vague and murky what is like at what point you're talking about, but a lot of like one of the good rule of thumbs I've heard is like and the kind of intense ones is like if your client heard you talking about it, they shouldn't be able to know it was them.
Sure.
Like that's how de-identified it should be. There's going to be a spectrum of that, what that looks like.
Yeah, depending on the case, of course.
Yeah, and depending on the circumstances.
Here's a question that's kind of related to this, and it's been a hot button topic over the past few months. I don't know if you follow any of my stuff or how familiar you are with any of the conversation we have.
Only a little bit. I'm sorry.
A lot of talk about people that are engaged in self-diagnosis online. When I say that, does that mean anything to you? Or yeah, go. What do you think about it?
I think I saw part of a conversation of you watching a video by an individual named Demon Mama.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Okay, so I think I saw. I don't. Okay, so the funny thing is that there are one or two diagnoses and instances where I can understand, like very specifically, honestly, very specifically, if you are an adult who feels like they fall, like are pretty high functioning but fall on the autism spectrum disorder. We for all that are for the high functioning end of the autism spectrum disorder, in children we don't have great tests, but we've got tests. We've actually basically just not got tests for adults.
Sure.
Like we just don't have it yet, really. You can kind of cobble together a test battery, kind of. But a lot of it is going to be, like, most of it is going to be self-report.
Self-report, yeah.
Do you feel like you fit these criteria?
Because I guess my guess is going to be that for people that are lower or higher, I guess, on that spectrum, they're going to have been so adaptive in their behaviors that, anything externally is not going to appear.
They're going to be masking most of the, like, when they're putting a lot of effort into tests, we're not going to be seeing the symptoms that they're internally experiencing because they're so good at hiding it to function in society.
And that's a really difficult like, it's difficult to engage with questions about who you really are. Right. Because I have so many weird interactions with people online. Sometimes I'll wonder about myself about certain things related to like ASPD or autism, because I feel like sometimes I think differently. But it's hard to be cognizant of these diagnoses, and then it's hard to figure out how much you're masking, and then it's hard to figure out how much you truly feel, and then it's hard to figure out how much that is off. There's like so much going on where it's like there's like two worlds. Either one, like a person could truly be very far off the spectrum, but they're very good at masking, and they kind of think that like most people do in some ways, and you just don't really know it. Or it could be that a person is actually truly super within the norm, but they know so much about the masking and everything, they're not really sure if they're engaged to some very deep level of self-deception, and it all gets like really weird.
Yes, I'm exactly. And I mean, this is part of the complication with like how psychology uses diagnoses. But I'll tell you that I know a number of clinicians that don't use diagnoses. Like why we use diagnoses and what they're useful for is up for a lot of debate, and a lot of clinicians will use them differently. There are plenty of clinicians. I know plenty of like clinical sites. Like I was trained, like my primary diagnostic training was by a clinician who says we are very conservative, not politically, but like in diagnosing individuals. Like we're going to find one diagnosis that fits all of the symptoms. If you are missing symptoms or if something that doesn't fit, you're probably not doing a good enough job diagnosing. Keep working at it. But I know other sites where they will slap on as many diagnoses as they can get fit, with the goal of, the point being, like, having a specific title attached to your medical chart is going to increase your ability to get specific kinds of care.
Unfortunately, yeah. And this was actually the most common thing that people would email me So I had one person come on, and she talked about how, this is a long time ago, she said that with her practice, they don't like to diagnose people at all. And she said that because oftentimes people will get trapped by a diagnosis, or a therapist will be more concerned. If you feel like a therapist is trying to diagnose you instead of genuinely understand you, it's a very alienating. Yeah. I had multiple supposedly therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists email me back, and they said, this is a really cool thing in like an idealistic vacuum, but sometimes people's insurance or like work time off or whatever requires a diagnosis for a medical prescription sometimes, whatever. So you kind of have to engage. Yeah.
I wouldn't even say sometimes. I'd say most of the time. Most of the time, insurance will not pay for talk therapy care or medication, what have you, unless you have certain diagnostic codes attached to your medical chart. And so, like, it's a weird game. So that site that's like that I know of that will slap on as many as possible. The mentality of it is, this will get you the care you need. We can always take these diagnoses off later. The goal is never to leave them on there.
Yeah.
It's always for them to let us get you the access to the care you need and then take them away. The hardship is that the rest of society doesn't get that part of the conversation. And so all they see is, wow, I have 7 different diagnoses. I'm really messed up. And it's like, well,
so this is, I had a take similar to this, and I'm curious on how you think or whatever, and I guess some people feel differently. I always feel like the goal of therapy should be to not be in therapy anymore. Like, you don't want it to be like an infinity thing. And sometimes, and I made a joke, it was kind of half joking, maybe a little serious, but I'm like, if you've been with a therapist for like 10 years, like, man, what's going on there? Like, yeah, it's kind of like when people talk to me like, oh yeah, I've got a really good chiropractor. I've been seeing him for like 7 years. Like, it sounds like they're not good at whatever they claim to be doing then, because what the fuck? But yeah, it feels like some people look at therapy as like an infinity thing where you're just supposed to do it for the rest of your life. I guess how is your
So this one is funny, and I have a complicated thought process on it. On one hand,
as opposed to the braiding stuff that was like very simple earlier. Okay, cool. Yeah, okay.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, on one hand, if someone is coming in and saying, I have a very specific symptom that I would like assistance with, I want this symptom reduced, help me reduce, right? Like, you're going to see your PCP and you're having trouble taking your diabetes medication regularly, and they go send you to the behavioral health clinician to work on building a plan to increase how often you take your diabetes medication.
Okay.
You're maybe going to go see that behavioral health clinician for 20 minutes, maybe 3 times. That's it, right? And that should be all you need, right? If well, I'm not going to put should on it, but like, hopefully that's all you need, right? And there's plenty of other places where, like, you're having an adjustment. A significant trauma history, and that is not necessarily work that is done in 8 sessions.
Of course, yeah, which is understandable, especially earlier. If we look at something called like the CPTSD or whatever, it would make sense that this is something that is going to be resolved in more than perhaps months or years of therapy, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. And then weirdly, like, and this is very much a personal opinion, but I kind of think that a future would be really interesting, not where, no. So first, let me preface, I know a psychologist who never terminates a client. But what that looks like is that the client comes in, they see each other regularly every week for maybe a month or 2, 3 months. And also, this psychologist very often is seeing pretty complex cases. This is not typically, I'm experiencing a little depression or anxiety. This is, I'm struggling with a narcissistic personality disorder diagnosis. Things like that, right? They see each other for a while, really regularly, and then we start what we call titrating out. So then maybe it starts shifting to every 2 weeks. Then it shifts to once a month. Then it shifts to once every 3 months. Then he moves to call me when you need a checkup.
Okay, sure.
And he'll almost functionally become kind of the family psychologist, and you just come and check in when you have something pretty intense happen, maybe trigger one of the long-standing issues you've been working on with with this psychologist,
Mm-hmm.
and you go and kind of get a refresher, touch base, and then go off again and move on.
Mm-hmm.
And so he never closes a client file unless the client like asks, like, I'm done seeing you, take me off your, close my file, I'm done. But with that frame in mind, I can picture a future or a society where we kind of view, like, maybe you do a bit of more regular work at some point in time, but then you kind of visit a psychologist the way you do your doctor for a wellness check once a year.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like
where-
that model makes sense to me. Now, I don't think most people, when they talk about seeing a therapist long term, don't seem to be talking about that. But if that is the case, obviously that's probably
Well,
fine.
I think you have a point that there's some people that will see a psychologist every week for an hour for 7 years, and at that point, I am having some questions about, like, okay, what is this psychologist actively helping you right now, or are they your safety crutch? And
Yeah,
are they
that's it. It feels
filling
more.
a
It's like,
relational hole that you should be getting somewhere else.
like I have somebody that will actually listen to me once a week for an
Right.
hour, and I can talk to this person basically. Yeah.
Right. Or, yeah. And I think people get, because it is a weird relationship, right? Like if your therapist is doing their job, you don't really know a heck of a lot about this person who you go and tell, like, the deepest parts of yourself to. And people who otherwise don't often experience super healthy relationships will think that this is the ideal relationship, when in actuality it'd be cool if you could then go out and find, like, partnerships with people where there's equal sharing and equal vulnerability and actual emotional intimacy versus what is a real relationship and an important relationship, but it's not a normal relationship with a therapist.
Something that I talk about sometimes on stream that I think is kind of funny is when you see really crazy people. That's a really derogatory term, but like people that are like serial killers or do like some pretty off the wall, out of the normal bounds of society shit. Oftentimes when they go into interrogation rooms and they're so eager to talk to cops or whatever, it seems like during interrogation they give up almost everything. Something that I bring up a lot is that it seems like for a lot of these people, this is true advice for like dates or friendships or relationships, people really like to talk about themselves. And I wonder for some of these people that are going in to talk to the police, if the reason why they're so keen to do it is because this is the first time in their lives potentially that they have somebody that is actually truly like invested in every single thing they have to say. Like this is the first time they found somebody to listen to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a solid possibility. There was a bunch of interesting work on, like, brain scans and stuff, factors that go into. It wasn't just serial killers; it was people who, people who have committed murder. And there were like 5 common factors that came up. It was like a 10% smaller amygdala, differently formed frontal cortex, a family history of it, like other people in their family line had also committed murder. I don't remember. It might have been there were only 4 things. The 4th thing was often child abuse. Was not having grown, actively not having grown up in a family that teaches moral behavior from immoral behavior. But like that coming paired with being actively abused.
Yeah.
And that being kind of like one of the interesting things, it turned out that the guy who was doing that research had 3 of the 4 things on that checklist. He just had really great parents who taught him right from wrong.
It sucks that there is so much. Or go ahead.
I possibly the 5th thing was technically a psychopathology diagnosis, but I don't remember. That's not important.
Yeah, I was gonna say it sucks that so much. It's hard to draw out, like, to tease out like what causes what too. For instance, so when you talk about like the, I imagine I guess we probably do know decently what the size of an average amygdala is because we probably cut into a lot of people that are just donating bodies to science and whatnot. But when it comes to like having reduced size, like does the reduced size of the amygdala cause other things, or is it just like having a certain type of childhood as a result of that environment causes a reduction in the size of the amygdala, like stuff like that? Yeah.
Right, both and. It's the nature versus nurture debate. Like what is something that is a function of biology that you popped up with, and then what is a function of the environment you've grown up with. Most of the time, the answer that we're coming up with these days is always both and.
Yeah.
Like it's an infinity sign feeding into each other.
Yeah, I used to debate people called, I don't know if you've ever heard of somebody called a race realist.
Yes.
Yeah, people that are very, very big believe in differences between the race. And there's a guy called a professor at Stanford called Robert Sapolsky. I imagine you've probably heard of him.
No, but I.
Oh, okay.
Please go on.
Yeah, he teaches a lot of like evolutionary biology and stuff like that, and it was in a lot of like biology related stuff. And something interesting that I picked up on that course, and I try to import this on or export this to every person I talk to, not like you, but like my audience or whatever, is the nature versus nurture is such an unbelievably stupid question, and it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as nature versus nurture. Like every gene necessarily expresses itself in an environment, and the sooner you wipe that distinction from your mind, the better understanding you can have of the complexities of
and oh, okay, and then this is I'm gonna add complexity to that, and that's gonna be a slightly obnoxious, I think, because people who aren't able to who are struggling to conceptualize that, this is going to just make it more difficult, because we do have diagnoses that seem to be more genetically loaded than others.
Sure. Schizophrenia, I think, is one that's like highly genetically heritable. Yeah,
that's one of those, like, if I have someone coming in and starting to report like what we call premodal symptoms, so early signs, one of the first questions I'm asking is, do you have someone in your family line with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, or a family member living in a cabin off in the middle of the woods somewhere, suspected or unsuspected, suspected or actually diagnosed case of schizophrenia in your family line? And if they do, like, I'm going to do actual testing, but that's the line I'm going to start looking down.
Sure, yeah, path. Of course, yeah.
Same with bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder has some pretty high genetic loading.
Yeah. Here's a question.
Yeah.
A little bit loaded. I really don't like when people talk about. I don't like it when people talk or think about themselves as functions of their diagnoses at all. So, for instance, and obviously it's hard for me to tell somebody don't do this, but like whenever I ask somebody a question, or whenever I inquire about behavior or anything like this, and somebody says something like, oh, like I can't do that, that's really difficult for me because of my ADHD, or like, oh yeah, I kind of like that, but being bipolar, it makes this hard. Sometimes I wonder if like these are used as like crutches too much, or it's like an ability to avoid. How do you feel about that in terms of people like framing conversations like day to day or whatever through their like a particular diagnosis they might have or something?
Yeah, that's one of those funny things. I mean, I agree with you, and I can see situations where I don't, right? So, like, I do think that a lot of times, like, again, going back to this concept of diagnoses are based on a medical model, but it's an incomplete model because we don't really know the causes of just about anything. And so when someone says like, well, I have depression. It's like, well, okay, we have a spectrum of symptoms that are expressed, that you seem to be expressing some number of, but what that looks like for you and what the root cause of that is could be completely different from the next person on the line with depression. Like, this is a lot of the time, if I give someone a diagnosis of depression, it's because this is a framework and a lens from which it's easiest for me to find a pathway to treat you, rather than because I'm looking at you and saying, I'm guessing there's some biological switch in your brain that is flipped to on, depression on, right? And so people are like, I have depression. And it's like, well, you have a set of symptoms that we have given frequently that expression of symptoms the name of depression, but what that means is going to be entirely specific to you.
Do you feel like you ever run into people where you get pushback on, where, I don't want to say they're shopping for a diagnosis, but like they're very convinced that they have a particular thing, and you might not feel like part of what they describe, they're either going too much by the book, or it feels like,
or depression and anxiety is one of the big ones, because that's something that's kind of, in conversation in society, it's become kind of watered down. And so there are individuals, and that's one of those things where it's like someone will come in and they're struggling, and therapy will help, but in order to get them the therapy, they need the title of major depressive disorder, even though they probably don't, like they maybe technically qualify, but their version of qualifying, like fitting the checklist, quote unquote, is not the same thing as the person who can't get out of bed.
Sure.
And so I have the person who's closer to, at least somewhat, like, I can't get out of bed, and I tell them, well, it seems like you're experiencing depression, and they say, no, I have a friend who experiences depression. That's not enough to express my internal distress.
Sure.
And then it's like, well, it is, but it's like a spectrum. Like, I get it. Like, I get what you're saying. You have very bad depression. Like, but there's not a category for that in the DSM-5, right? Or I'll get the opposite, right? I'll get people who will be like, oh, I can't have anxiety. I have friends who have actual anxiety, and like, I'm not that bad. And I'm like, well, I think this is a good expression of what you're experiencing. It's just maybe they have a worse version of it, or maybe they're expressing it outwardly where you bury it all inside. And so I don't know. Yeah, so I do get that, and it is complicated, and I do get why, like, I get why but then the funny nuance to add to that question about, like, people using it as, I don't know, an excuse, is that a word you're kind of...
I guess not maybe an excuse, but maybe like, I guess excuse is like a really weird, that's a really derogatory way to say it, but like as a way to avoid basically having a challenging experience, or kind of like this is like, it less, rather than like this is a state of mind or a temporary stop of my life, this has become like an identity, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I'm not a person with ADHD, I am an ADHD person, or I'm not a person with this particular whatever, this is part of who I am now, and it is forever who I will be.
Yeah, and that's hard. Yeah, I think that we've come up with there's this complicated balance where we're trying to describe, like, because if in society, if we're trying to make space for an understanding around, like, if I have a teenager who's experiencing symptoms of depression, and I have mom and dad who don't really believe in psychology, and they're like, why no, my teenager's just moody, like, they're just being, like, deliberately disobedient, right? Then it's really helpful for me to say, well, no, this is like a disease, like, this isn't a choice your child is making. On the other hand, it's not really a disease. Like, I'm kind of fudging that when I say that, right? Because it's a set of symptoms, and that's all I have. Like, I can guess that there's something going on in the brain at the root of that, but I have no idea what that is. And neither does, I mean, maybe if we continue to do MRI scans on people with depression, we will have a concept, but not yet.
Sure.
And so there's, like, this complicated walking line, this path that we balance on, where it's like, okay, well, it's very, but we don't actually know what we're pointing at.
Yeah, and it's a very goal-oriented conversation. So if you were talking to a person, they're like, "Man, I really want to, do something to help with my depression," like, you wouldn't be screaming at them like, "It's a disease. There's a root cause. Fuck you." Whereas if you had like a group of parents that were talking about their children, like, "Oh, well, we think our children are just choosing to be a lazy fuck every day and never get out of bed." You're like, "Okay, well, hold on. Like, they have almost like the agency is challenged here. Like, there's a disease, right? It depends. It's a goal-oriented kind of thing, right? Yeah.
And that's I think the point is that, in a lot of ways, all of the times we use diagnoses is in some frame of a goal-oriented conversation. Like, there's no point in psychologists using diagnoses outside of a goal-oriented conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's the conversation I have typically. Is like the only purpose of a diagnosis is that it gives us a treatment. Otherwise, there's
Yeah, but how do we move forward?
True. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else?
No. My brain is empty.
Okay. Well, I think that's all I got.
Cool.
Okay, well, hey, listen, I appreciate the conversation. If you ever hear me say anything that triggers you about psychology, if you think I'm wrong or incorrect on anything, feel free to poke me or give me an email. We can chat. And yeah, otherwise, good luck. Have fun. Be careful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation.
This was a blast. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Have fun. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Nerd. What's that noise? It's fucking hot in my room, huh? What? I'm opening my door because it's hot. I'm almost done. Could you elaborate a bit on the nature versus nurture thing? Just basically, no, I don't want to get into it. All I'm going to say is that like no gene exists independent of your environment, and every gene necessarily expresses itself in an environment. Every gene has an environment. It's helpful in the mind to not see a huge distinction sometimes. This idea that like some things are nature, some things are nurture. That distinction is always going to be way more blurry in real life than it might seem. Yeah. Who was that girl? Oh, it was a psychologist person that emailed me that wanted to chat about things. Aren't you just describing a phenotype? Kind of. Well, a phenotype is just an expression of a gene, but I'm just saying that, like, yeah, I think I said what I said. Okay. Damn. Okay. I'm fucking tired. What hope pilled you on climate change? Honest to God, it was the price of solar energy. Jesus. Oh, now Wicked Supreme's talking to Mr. Girl. Nice. Who should I host? Who are we hosting? Raid Moon? He's got like 14,000 viewers, okay? Wait, did I just throw the campfire into the... Do you think we have good batteries for solar energy? I think the battery stuff has not been worked out yet, but... Host a raid streamer? Raid Shadow Legends. What is the Nicole T up to? Outfit change. Oh shit. We'll host Mr. Girl Returns Fire. We haven't hosted him in a while. He can go chat. No shit, I should host Wicked Supreme. If I host people that he's talking to, does that make it seem I'm not like being like passive aggressive, right? Okay, I'll just host Mr. Girl. Alright. I think guys, it's been fun. The fuck are these noises?